A man once stood in front of 3,000 light bulbs that had already failed and said, with complete calm, that he hadn't failed once. That man was Thomas Edison. And the strange part isn't that he said it. The strange part is that he actually believed it. Not as a clever quote for later. In that exact moment, surrounded by what looked, to everyone else, like proof that the impossible was exactly that, impossible. Something in the way he was thinking made failure invisible to him. Not because he was delusional, because his mind was operating by a different rule than the one most of us were taught. Here's the question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. What if the impossible isn't a fact about the world? What if it's a description of how a mind hasn't learned to think yet? That's what we're going to take apart today. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone at some point in their life. You're standing in front of something you want, badly, honestly, completely, and a wall appears. Not a physical wall, a felt one. A wall made entirely out of the word impossible. And here's what's strange about that wall. If you actually stop and examine it closely, it rarely shows up as a logical conclusion you arrived at through careful reasoning. It shows up faster than that. It shows up as a feeling, almost instant, almost automatic, before you've even had time to think the situation through. You look at the goal. You look at your current resources, your current circumstances, your current self. And something inside you, faster than conscious thought, declares the gap unbridgeable. Napoleon Hill spent decades studying men who, by every reasonable measure, should have hit that same wall. Men who started with nothing. Men who were told directly, by people who loved them, that what they wanted simply wasn't realistic. Men who had every external reason to accept that the thing they wanted was impossible for someone like them. And what Hill found, again and again, wasn't that these men had some special advantage that let them bypass the wall. It was that, for reasons Hill spent years trying to understand, the wall never fully formed in their minds the way it forms in everyone else's. Here's what I mean by that. When most people encounter the word impossible, they experience it as information, a fact about reality, delivered by their own mind, that they then accept and build their decisions around. Impossible becomes a stopping point, a place where effort is no longer worth spending because the outcome has already been determined. But Hill discovered something genuinely strange when he studied the men who built extraordinary lives. For them, the word impossible functioned differently, not as a conclusion, as a description of current information, a snapshot of what hadn't been figured out yet, not a verdict on what could never be figured out. This distinction sounds small when you say it out loud. It is not small in practice. Because if impossible is a permanent fact, the only reasonable response is to stop, to redirect your energy towards something more achievable, to accept the limitation and build a smaller life around it. But if impossible is just a temporary description of incomplete information, the response is completely different. You don't stop. You get curious. Hill noticed this quality specifically in the language these men used, even in casual conversation. They rarely said something couldn't be done. They said it hadn't been done yet. They rarely said a problem had no solution. They said the solution hadn't been found yet. That tiny linguistic shift, yet, was doing enormous work underneath the surface. Think about what that single word actually does to a mind encountering a difficult problem. Without it, impossible closes a door completely. The mind stops searching, because searching for something declared impossible feels irrational, even embarrassing. With it, the exact same difficulty becomes something else entirely. A puzzle still being solved. A door that's locked, not bricked over. Something requiring more information, more creativity, more persistence, but not something fundamentally, permanently closed. Hill came to believe that this single distinction, whether your mind interprets impossible as permanent or temporary, might be the most significant factor separating people who build extraordinary lives from people who don't. Not intelligence, not resources, not even circumstances in the way most people assume. The specific architecture of how a mind processes the feeling of this can't be done. And here's what should genuinely unsettle you a little the longer you sit with this idea. If that's true, if the wall most people hit is actually constructed by the mind itself, rather than being an accurate report of reality, then the impossible things in your own life right now might not be as fixed as they currently feel. They might just be facts about what your mind hasn't yet figured out how to think through. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the wall isn't actually made of reality, what exactly is it made of? Hill spent years trying to answer that exact question, and what he found wasn't comfortable. The wall most people experience as impossible isn't built from facts about the external world. It's built from memory. Specifically, it's built from every previous moment in your life where you attempted something difficult and it didn't work. Every failed attempt, every rejection, every time reality pushed back against your effort and won. Your mind, trying to protect you, takes all of that accumulated evidence and compresses it into a single, instant judgment whenever you encounter something new that resembles those old failures. Not because your mind is broken, because that's literally what minds are designed to do. Pattern recognition kept your ancestors alive. If something hurt you once, your mind makes sure you feel a warning the next time something similar appears. The problem is that this same protective mechanism, incredibly useful for avoiding physical danger, becomes a serious liability when applied to ambition. Because your mind doesn't actually distinguish, at the level where this warning gets generated, between this specific thing will definitely fail again, and something vaguely similar to this once didn't work years ago under completely different circumstances. It just produces the feeling, the wall, the instant sense of impossible, delivered with the same urgency as a warning about physical danger, even though what's actually being threatened is just your comfort, your ego, your willingness to risk disappointment again. Hill found that the men who built extraordinary lives had, in nearly every case, learned to do something specific with this mechanism. Not eliminate it. That's not actually possible, and Hill never claimed it was. They had learned to recognize it for what it actually was. A feeling generated by old data, not a fact about new possibility. This is harder to do than it sounds, because the feeling itself is genuinely convincing. When the wall appears, it doesn't feel like an outdated pattern firing inappropriately. It feels like wisdom. It feels like the mature, realistic part of you finally speaking up to protect you from wasting time on something that won't work. That's exactly what makes it so effective at stopping people. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like truth. Hill documented case after case of men who had to learn to separate those two things. The feeling of certainty that something was impossible, and the actual evidence for whether it was impossible, because for most of their lives, those two things had felt identical. Here's an exercise that emerges directly from Hill's research, something worth sitting with honestly. Think of something in your own life right now that feels impossible. Not mildly difficult. Genuinely, in your gut, impossible. Now ask yourself a question Hill's subjects learned to ask themselves, almost as a reflex, whenever that feeling arrived. Is this impossible, or does this just remind me of something that didn't work before? Those are not the same question, even though they produce an identical feeling in the body. The first one is asking about objective reality. The second one is asking about your personal history. And the gap between those two questions, according to everything Hill documented, is exactly where the impossible quietly becomes possible, not through magic, not through blind positivity, but through the simple, repeated practice of noticing when your mind is reporting old fear as if it were new fact. This is genuinely uncomfortable work, because it requires going back into the specific moments where the wall was built, not in a way that requires reliving trauma dramatically, just in a way that requires honest acknowledgement. Where did this specific impossible come from? Whose voice is actually underneath it? Hill found that almost every limiting belief he encountered in his research, when traced back far enough, had an origin point, a specific moment, or a specific person where the belief that something wasn't possible for someone like you first took root. And here's what's remarkable about that discovery. Once these men found the origin point, once they could see clearly that the wall had been built at a specific moment, by specific limited information, rather than being some eternal truth about reality, something shifted. The wall didn't disappear immediately. That's not how this works. But it stopped being invisible. And the moment something stops being invisible is the exact moment you can start doing something about it. Let me tell you about a man Hill never actually interviewed directly, but whose story circulated among the people Hill did study, because it illustrated something almost all of them had experienced in their own lives. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, brings something he built to his father. Something rough, imperfect, but built entirely from his own imagination. And the father, tired from work, distracted, not unkind but not paying close attention either, glances at it and says something dismissive. Not cruel, just careless. Something like, "That's not how it's supposed to work," or "You'll never figure that out." Said the way adults often say things to children without realizing the weight those words will carry decades later. The boy doesn't remember the exact words by the time he's 40, but he remembers the feeling. And that feeling, small, almost forgettable in the moment it happened, became the seed of a wall that would show up, disguised as realism, every single time that man encountered a creative idea for the rest of his life. He wouldn't consciously connect his hesitation, decades later, to that specific afternoon with his father. He'd just feel the wall arrive. That's not how it's supposed to work. Every time he tried to build something unconventional. And he'd assume, the way most people assume, that the feeling was current, relevant, true. Hill found this pattern everywhere once he started looking for it. The wall almost never originates in adulthood. It originates earlier, often much earlier, in moments so small that the person carrying the resulting belief usually can't even remember the original incident by the time it's shaping their major life decisions. A teacher's offhand comment about a child not being the academic type. A parent's anxious warning about financial risk, born from their own unhealed fear, passed down as if it were universal wisdom. A sibling's casual mockery of an early ambition, repeated enough times that it eventually became internal narration instead of an external voice. None of these moments feel significant when they happen. That's exactly what makes them so effective at shaping a life. Nobody braces against a small comment the way they'd brace against a major trauma. The small comments slip past your defenses precisely because they don't feel dangerous. And then they sit there, quietly, for decades, reactivating every time you approach something that resembles the original situation, disguised every single time as your own mature judgment rather than what it actually is, a child's interpretation of a careless adult moment, still running in the background of an adult mind that has long since outgrown the actual limitation. Here's why this matters enormously for understanding how thinking actually creates the impossible. If the wall was built by a single careless sentence, decades ago, from someone who likely doesn't even remember saying it, then the wall was never actually a measurement of your real capability. It was a measurement of someone else's limited perspective, absorbed at a moment when you had no defenses against it, now mistaken for your own settled truth about what's possible for you. Hill watched men do something specific once they understood this. Not erase the old memory. That's not how minds actually work, and pretending otherwise does more harm than good. Instead, they learned to do something more precise. They learned to hear the wall arrive, that familiar, convincing sense of impossible, and ask, almost immediately, whose voice that actually was. Not as a rhetorical exercise, as a genuine, repeated practice of separating their adult judgment from a borrowed limitation they'd been carrying since childhood without ever examining where it came from. This single practice, according to Hill's research, accounts for an enormous amount of the difference between people who eventually accomplish what looks impossible and people who quietly accept smaller lives without ever questioning why certain doors always felt closed to them specifically. Now, I want you to do something. If any part of what I just described landed somewhere real in you, if you can feel, even faintly, an old wall that might not actually be yours, I want you to write the word I believe in the comments right now. Not because it changes anything by itself, but because naming it out loud in front of other people doing the same work is the first practical step in separating an old borrowed limitation from your actual current capability. The people who write that today are the ones who, months from now, will look back and recognize this as the moment the wall started to lose its grip. Write it, and let's keep going. Because once you can see where the wall came from, there's a deeper question Hill needed to answer. If the wall isn't real, what do you actually replace it with? This is where Hill's research gets genuinely interesting, because identifying the problem is the easy part. Knowing the wall is borrowed, knowing it came from somewhere small and long forgotten, doesn't automatically make it disappear. Hill understood this clearly, and he was suspicious of anyone who claimed otherwise. Awareness alone, he found, rarely produces lasting change. What he discovered instead was that the wall has to be replaced with something. Not just removed, but actively substituted with a different mental structure, because an empty space where a limiting belief used to live doesn't stay empty for long. Something fills it. And if you're not deliberate about what fills it, the old pattern tends to quietly rebuild itself. The men Hill studied who successfully dismantled their own walls had developed a specific replacement. He called it, in his own language, a working faith. I want to be careful with that phrase, because it's been stripped of its actual meaning by decades of motivational language that turned it into something soft and decorative. Hill wasn't talking about blind optimism. He wasn't talking about pretending difficult things are easy, or repeating affirmations you don't actually believe. Working faith, as Hill documented it, was something far more specific and far more demanding. It was the practiced ability to act as though an outcome were certain, before any evidence existed to confirm it. Not because you'd convinced yourself reality had already changed, but because you understood that the action itself was part of what would eventually create the evidence. This is a subtle distinction, and it's worth sitting with. Most people wait for belief to arrive before they act. They want to feel certain the impossible thing is achievable before they commit real effort toward it. And because that certainty almost never arrives in advance, because by definition, you can't have proof of something that hasn't happened yet, most people simply never begin. The men Hill studied operated in reverse order. They acted first, with a kind of disciplined, almost stubborn consistency, and let the belief follow the action rather than waiting for the belief to precede it. Edison didn't feel certain, in any conventional sense, during those thousands of failed experiments. What he had instead was something more useful than certainty. A working faith that each failed attempt was narrowing the field of possibility, bringing him closer to the configuration that would actually work, even though he had no way of knowing, in any given month, how many more attempts remained before he reached it. That's a genuinely difficult psychological position to hold. Acting with full commitment toward an outcome you cannot yet prove will happen, sustained not by evidence, but by a deliberately chosen orientation toward the work itself. Hill found that this working faith could be built, deliberately, through a specific practice almost nobody else describes accurately. It starts small, not with the impossible thing itself, but with smaller commitments where you deliberately act before feeling fully certain, and then pay close attention to what happens. Not to prove the universe will always reward you. That's not what this is about. But to slowly retrain your own nervous system's relationship with uncertainty. Most people's nervous systems have learned, over years, that uncertainty is dangerous. That not knowing the outcome in advance is a signal to stop, to wait, to gather more information before committing. Hill found that successful men had, often without realizing they were doing it, retrained that exact response. They had taught their own nervous systems, through repeated small experiences, that uncertainty was simply the normal condition of doing anything worthwhile, not a red flag. not a warning, just the weather you work in. This retraining doesn't happen through a single decision. It happens through repetition, the same way any physical skill gets built. Small moments where you choose to act despite the absence of certainty, and then notice, consciously, that the world didn't end, that the discomfort was survivable, that uncertainty, experienced enough times without catastrophe, gradually stops triggering the same intensity of alarm. Over months and years, this practice does something remarkable to a person's relationship with the impossible. The wall doesn't disappear all at once, but your willingness to act despite its presence steadily increases until, eventually, the wall becomes almost irrelevant. Not because it stopped appearing, but because you stopped needing it to disappear before you were willing to move forward anyway. This is, according to Hill, the actual mechanism behind everything that looks like courage from the outside, not the absence of fear or doubt. The practiced willingness to act in their presence, consistently, until the action itself becomes more familiar than the hesitation ever was. And there's a reason this matters more than it might initially seem. A reason connected to something Hill discovered about how the mind actually processes repeated action over time. Something that explains why certain people seem to get more capable specifically in the areas where they once felt most limited. Hill didn't have access to modern neuroscience. He was writing decades before anyone could observe what was actually happening inside a brain as it formed new patterns. But what he documented through pure observation lines up, almost precisely, with what we understand now about how thinking actually reshapes the mind over time. Here's what he noticed, long before there was a scientific framework to explain it. The men who repeatedly acted despite uncertainty didn't just become more comfortable with discomfort in a general sense. Something more specific happened. The exact areas where they had once felt most incapable became, over years of repeated effort, the areas where they eventually demonstrated the most skill. This seems almost too convenient to be true. Wouldn't it make more sense if people naturally excelled in the areas where they started with natural advantage and remained limited in the areas where they started weak? That's not what Hill found. What he found, again and again, was that the specific domain where someone had once felt the most impossible resistance often became, years later, the exact domain where they demonstrated their most unusual capability. The reason for this isn't mystical. It's mechanical, even though Hill didn't have the vocabulary to describe the mechanism precisely. When you repeatedly act despite a feeling of impossibility, you're not just pushing through resistance. You're forcing your mind to generate new strategies, new approaches, new angles of attack on the problem, because the old approaches, the ones that produced the original feeling of impossible, clearly weren't working. This forced creativity, sustained over enough repetitions, builds something Hill observed but couldn't fully name. A kind of specialized capability that only develops in exactly the areas where someone has been forced, repeatedly, to find new solutions because the obvious ones failed. Think about what this actually means for understanding the impossible things in your own life. The area where you currently feel the most resistance, the goal that feels most genuinely impossible, the skill that feels most permanently out of reach, might actually be exactly where you're positioned to develop the most unusual capability, precisely because the difficulty is forcing a kind of creative problem-solving that easier domains never require. This reframes the entire emotional experience of struggling with something difficult. Most people interpret intense difficulty as evidence they're in the wrong domain, that the resistance is a signal to redirect their efforts somewhere easier, somewhere more naturally suited to their existing strengths. Hill's research suggests almost the opposite. The domains that produce the most resistance are often, precisely because of that resistance, the domains capable of producing the most unusual results, but only for the people willing to stay engaged with the difficulty long enough for this mechanism to actually work. This doesn't mean every difficult thing is secretly your hidden genius waiting to emerge. Hill wasn't naive about that. Some things genuinely aren't the right fit, regardless of effort invested. The distinction matters, and it's worth being honest about. But Hill found a specific marker that helped distinguish between productive difficulty and genuine mismatch. Productive difficulty, the kind that eventually produces unusual capability, comes with what he described as a persistent pull, a sense that despite the resistance, despite the repeated failure, something in you keeps returning to the problem anyway, almost involuntarily. Genuine mismatch, by contrast, comes with relief when you stop. The difficulty feels purely unpleasant, without any pull drawing you back toward it once you've stepped away. This distinction matters enormously because it gives you a practical way to evaluate your own impossible things. Not by how difficult they feel. Difficulty alone doesn't tell you anything useful, but by whether, underneath the difficulty, something in you keeps pulling back toward the problem even after you've tried to let it go. If that pull exists, Hill's research suggests you may be standing exactly where the mechanism we've been discussing is most likely to work in your favor, not despite the resistance, but because of it. The impossible thing you keep returning to, despite repeated failure, despite every reasonable signal suggesting you should redirect your energy elsewhere, might be exactly where your mind is being forced to develop a capability that easier paths would never have required. This raises a question that Hill spent considerable time trying to answer. If staying engaged with productive difficulty is what eventually produces unusual capability, what actually determines whether someone stays engaged long enough for the mechanism to complete itself, rather than quitting somewhere in the middle before the capability has fully formed? Hill found the answer to that question in a place he didn't initially expect. It wasn't discipline in the way most people use that word. Discipline, by itself, turned out to be a relatively weak predictor of who stayed engaged with difficulty long enough to develop real capability and who quietly gave up somewhere in the middle. What actually determined persistence was something closer to identity. Specifically, whether the person had begun to see the difficult pursuit as something connected to who they fundamentally were, not just something they were trying to accomplish, but something they had started to understand as an expression of their own character. This distinction changes everything about how difficulty gets experienced. When you're pursuing something purely as an external goal, a result you want, separate from your sense of self, every setback feels like evidence against the goal's viability. The natural response to enough setbacks is to question whether the goal makes sense at all, and eventually, to abandon it in favor of something that seems more achievable. But when the pursuit has become connected to identity, when continuing to engage with the difficulty has become part of how you understand who you are, rather than just something you're trying to get, setbacks get processed completely differently. A setback doesn't threaten the goal anymore. It becomes, instead, simply another data point in an ongoing story about the kind of person you've decided to be. The kind of person who keeps engaging with difficult things. The kind of person who doesn't abandon a problem just because it hasn't been solved yet. Hill watched this shift happen in the men he studied, almost always at some specific, identifiable point in their journey. Early on, they were pursuing their impossible goal as something they wanted. Later, sometimes years later, sometimes after significant struggle, something shifted and the pursuit became something closer to who they were. This shift, according to Hill's research, is what actually separates the people who eventually accomplish what looked impossible from the people who give up somewhere in the difficult middle, even when both groups started with similar levels of talent and similar circumstances. I want you to think about your own impossible thing for a moment. Are you pursuing it as something you want, a result separate from yourself that you're trying to obtain? Or has it become, even slightly, connected to who you understand yourself to be? The kind of person who engages with this specific kind of difficulty, regardless of whether the outcome has arrived yet? That shift, from wanting something to becoming someone who pursues it, is, according to everything Hill documented, one of the most reliable predictors of whether the impossible eventually becomes possible. And here's something worth sitting with honestly. That shift isn't something you can force through willpower alone. It tends to happen gradually, through repeated engagement with the difficulty, through the accumulation of small moments where you choose to continue despite having every reasonable excuse to stop. Each time you make that choice, to stay engaged, to return to the problem, to keep working at something that hasn't yielded results yet, you're not just making progress toward the goal. You're quietly reinforcing an identity, becoming, in small increments, the kind of person for whom this particular impossible thing is simply part of who they are, rather than a wish they're still hoping will come true. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Hill became fascinated, later in his research, with isolating the exact moment this identity shift actually happened. Not the general pattern. He'd already documented that clearly, but the specific instant, if such an instant could even be identified, where someone stopped merely wanting an outcome and started becoming the kind of person who pursued it as part of their character. What he found surprised him. It almost never happened during a moment of success. You'd expect, reasonably, that identity would shift after some kind of breakthrough, a piece of evidence that the impossible thing was actually possible, which then gave the person permission to start identifying with the pursuit more deeply. That's not the pattern Hill documented. Instead, the shift almost always happened during a moment of failure. Specifically, a moment of failure significant enough that the person seriously considered quitting, and then, for reasons that weren't always clear even to them, chose to continue anyway. This detail matters enormously, and it's worth understanding precisely why. When you continue after an easy success, you haven't actually proven anything to yourself about who you are. Success that arrives without serious resistance doesn't require you to examine your own commitment, because nothing ever threatened that commitment in the first place. But when you continue after a failure significant enough that quitting would have been the reasonable choice, when stopping would have made complete sense to anyone watching from outside, something different happens internally. You're forced, in that specific moment, to answer a question you can't avoid. Why am I still doing this, when every reasonable signal suggests I should stop? And the answer you give yourself in that moment, according to Hill's research, becomes the actual foundation of the identity shift we've been discussing. If the honest answer is some version of, because this is who I am now, this is what I do, this is part of how I understand myself, that's the moment the shift completes. Not gradually, in that instance. Specifically, in that exact decision, made in the aftermath of failure significant enough to have justified quitting. Hill documented this pattern across nearly every man he studied who eventually accomplished something that had genuinely looked impossible from the outside. There was always a specific failure, always a moment where quitting would have been reasonable, even expected, and always, in the men who eventually succeeded, a specific decision in the aftermath of that failure, made without external validation, made without any new evidence that success was actually coming, to continue anyway. This reframes something important about how you should think about your own significant failures, if you're currently in the middle of pursuing something that feels impossible. The failure itself isn't separate from the process of becoming someone capable of the impossible outcome. It might actually be the specific mechanism through which that becoming happens. Not because failure is good in some abstract sense. Hill wasn't romanticizing difficulty for its own sake, but because the moment of genuine failure, the moment where quitting would be completely reasonable, is also, simultaneously, the exact moment where you're forced to discover whether the pursuit has become part of your identity or whether it was always just an external goal you were willing to abandon once it got difficult enough. You can't know the answer to that question in advance. You only find out in the actual moment, when failure has made quitting reasonable and you're forced to choose, consciously or not, who you're going to be in response. This is why Hill considered significant failure not as the opposite of eventual success, but as one of its necessary preconditions. Not every failure leads to this identity shift. Some failures genuinely do signal that a redirection makes sense. But the specific kind of failure that arrives in the middle of a pursuit you haven't yet fully identified with, that particular kind of failure functions almost like a test, revealing whether the pursuit has become who you are or remains merely something you wanted. And the men who passed that test, according to everything Hill documented, weren't operating from extraordinary confidence in that exact moment. Most of them described genuine uncertainty, genuine doubt about whether continuing made sense. What they had, instead of confidence, was something Hill considered more reliable, a decision made without full certainty to keep going anyway, not because they knew it would work, but because some part of them had already, even if they couldn't articulate it clearly, started to understand the pursuit as inseparable from who they were. There's a question Hill started asking, later in his life, that he found more revealing than almost anything else in his research. He'd ask it of younger men who came to him for advice, hoping to shortcut their way toward whatever he'd discovered in those 500 interviews. The question was simple, almost deceptively so. What would you attempt if you knew, with absolute certainty, that you could not fail? Most people, when they first hear this question, treat it as a kind of imaginative exercise, a way of dreaming bigger, removing the constraint of fear so you can identify what you'd actually want if fear weren't part of the equation. Hill found something more useful underneath the question than that. He found that the answer people gave revealed, almost immediately, where their actual impossible thing was hiding. Often a thing they'd stopped consciously thinking about years earlier, because the wall around it had become so familiar that it no longer registered as a wall at all. It just felt like the boundary of reality itself. Here's why this question works as well as it does. Most people ask directly what they want, give an answer shaped by what feels achievable. The question gets filtered, almost instantly and unconsciously, through years of accumulated walls, old failures, old criticism, old evidence about what's realistic for someone like them. The answer that emerges isn't really their desire. It's their desire after it's been edited down to fit inside what they've already decided is possible. But removing the variable of failure changes the filter completely. If failure isn't a possible outcome, the old walls become irrelevant. The mind, freed from needing to protect itself against disappointment, often produces an answer that surprises the person giving it. Something bigger than what they would have said if you'd simply asked what they wanted. Something that, the moment they hear themselves say it out loud, makes them slightly uncomfortable, because some part of them immediately recognizes how far that answer is from what they've been quietly settling for. Hill considered this discomfort genuinely important information, because the gap between what you'd attempt without fear of failure and what you're actually attempting right now, that gap is, more often than not, an accurate map of exactly where your impossible thing has been hiding. I want you to actually do this, not just listen to me describe it. What would you attempt, right now, in your actual life, if you knew with complete certainty that you could not fail? Don't immediately edit the answer down to something more reasonable. Let yourself hear the full, uncomfortable size of it first. Hill found that most people, when they finally let themselves answer this honestly, discovered something uncomfortable about their current life. Not that they'd been lazy or uncommitted or lacking ambition in some general sense. Something more specific. They discovered that they'd been pursuing a smaller version of their actual desire, a version edited down by fear until it felt safe enough to attempt, and had, somewhere along the way, started mistaking that smaller version for what they actually wanted. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it has direct implications for understanding why certain goals, even when pursued with real effort, never quite produce the sense of fulfillment people expect from them. If you've edited your actual desire down to something smaller, Achieving the smaller version was never going to feel the way you imagined achieving your actual desire would feel, because it isn't actually your actual desire. It's a compromise your mind made, years ago, in order to avoid the discomfort of pursuing something that genuinely felt impossible. Hill watched this pattern explain a specific kind of quiet dissatisfaction in otherwise successful people. They'd accomplished real things, by any external measure. But something underneath the accomplishment still felt unfinished, still felt like it hadn't quite addressed the original desire. Because it hadn't. The original desire, the full, uncomfortable, genuinely impossible feeling version, was still sitting there, untouched, underneath the smaller version they'd actually pursued. This raises an obvious but difficult question. If you've identified your actual impossible thing, the full version, not the edited one, what do you actually do with that information? Because knowing what you'd attempt without fear of failure doesn't automatically remove the fear. The fear is still there. The wall is still there. What changes is something more subtle, but, according to Hill, ultimately more important than removing the fear ever could be. Hill found that the value of identifying your actual impossible thing wasn't that it removed fear. It was that it removed confusion. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Most people move through their lives with a kind of low-grade, unspecified dissatisfaction. A sense that something is missing, that they're capable of more, that there's some version of their life that would feel more aligned with who they actually are, without being able to name, specifically, what that version actually involves. This vagueness is, according to Hill's research, almost as damaging as the fear itself. Because you can't apply any of the principles we've discussed so far, working faith, repeated action despite uncertainty, the gradual identity shift that happens through engaging with difficulty, to something you haven't actually identified clearly. You can't develop courage toward an unspecified target. Once you've done the work of identifying your actual impossible thing, not the edited, safer version, but the full original desire, something shifts in how the rest of these principles actually apply to your life. The fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes specific, pointed at something real, rather than diffused across a general sense of unfulfilled potential. And specific fear, according to everything Hill documented, is dramatically easier to work with than vague dissatisfaction. Here's why. Vague dissatisfaction has no clear action attached to it. You can't take a concrete step toward feeling more fulfilled or living up to your potential. Those phrases describe a feeling, not a direction. So the dissatisfaction just sits there, unresolved, generating a quiet background hum of unease that never resolves into anything actionable. But specific fear, attached to a specific impossible thing, has an obvious next step, even if that step is genuinely difficult. If your actual impossible thing is starting a business you've been avoiding for a decade, the fear is specific. So is the action available to address it. You can't take a vague step toward more fulfillment, but you can take a specific step toward registering that business, or having that first difficult conversation, or building that first version of the thing you've been avoiding. This is why Hill considered the exercise of identifying your true impossible thing so essential, even though it doesn't resolve anything by itself. It transforms an unworkable problem, vague, directionless dissatisfaction, into a workable one. Specific fear, attached to a specific goal, that can actually be engaged with using everything else we've discussed. I want to address something directly, because I think it matters for how you actually use everything in this video. Some of you, hearing all of this, are mentally constructing reasons why your specific situation is different. Why the principles Hill documented don't quite apply to your circumstances, your responsibilities, your particular version of impossible. Hill encountered this resistance constantly in his research, and he came to recognize it as one of the most consistent obstacles he documented, more consistent, in some ways, than the original fear itself. He called it the search for the exception. The mind, faced with a principle that would require real change if accepted, often goes looking for reasons why it doesn't apply this time. Not consciously, usually. It feels like genuine reasoning, legitimate consideration of real constraints. But Hill found that almost everyone he studied who eventually accomplished something impossible had, at some point, faced circumstances that looked, by any reasonable measure, like a legitimate exception. Real financial constraints, real family responsibilities, real disadvantages that would have justified, to almost anyone observing from outside, a decision to pursue something smaller and safer instead. They didn't succeed because they didn't have real obstacles. They succeeded because they decided, despite genuinely real obstacles, that those obstacles described their current circumstances rather than their permanent limitation. This brings us back to where we started, the distinction between impossible as a permanent fact and impossible as a temporary description of incomplete information. Your specific obstacles are real. Hill never asked anyone to pretend otherwise. But real obstacles and permanent impossibility are not the same thing, no matter how convincingly they can feel identical in the moment you're facing them. By this point in his research, Hill had identified most of the individual pieces. The way the mind constructs walls from old memory rather than current reality. The role of working faith in acting before certainty arrives. The mechanism through which repeated engagement with difficulty produces unusual capability. The identity shift that happens specifically in the aftermath of failure significant enough to justify quitting. But he was missing something. A way these pieces actually work together, in practice, on an ordinary day, rather than existing as separate principles you'd need to consciously remember and apply one at a time. What he eventually documented was less a technique and more a daily orientation, something the men he studied did almost without realizing they were doing it, because it had become so integrated into how they moved through their days that it no longer felt like a deliberate practice at all. He called it, in his own private notes, working the edge. The edge, in this context, meant something specific. The boundary between what currently felt comfortable and what currently felt impossible. Not the comfortable center of someone's existing capability, where they could operate without any resistance at all, and not the genuinely impossible periphery, so far beyond current capability that engaging with it produced only confusion rather than productive difficulty. Specifically the edge, the place just beyond current comfort, where resistance was present but not overwhelming, where the feeling of impossible showed up but hadn't yet become so intense that it produced paralysis instead of effort. Hill found that the men who built extraordinary lives had developed an almost daily habit of locating this edge and deliberately operating there, rather than retreating to comfort or attempting to leap straight to the genuinely impossible without the intermediate steps. This is less dramatic than most people expect when they hear about men who accomplished impossible things. There's a cultural mythology around sudden, heroic leaps, the dramatic moment where someone abandons everything safe and lunges directly toward their biggest dream. That's not what Hill actually documented. What he found instead was something quieter and, frankly, more sustainable. A daily practice of identifying the current edge, whatever felt slightly beyond comfortable that day, in whatever specific domain they were working on, and choosing to engage with exactly that, rather than either retreating to safety or attempting something so far beyond current capability that it produced overwhelm instead of growth. This edge moves over time. What felt like the edge a year ago becomes comfortable territory, absorbed into expanded capability, and a new edge forms slightly further out. The practice isn't a single decision made once. It's a continuous orientation applied daily that gradually expands what falls inside the boundary of comfortable and pushes the boundary of impossible further and further outward. Hill considered this the actual mechanism behind what looks, from a distance, like a single dramatic transformation. Someone who appears to have suddenly accomplished something impossible has almost always, on closer inspection, been working the edge daily for years, gradually expanding their actual capability until the thing that once looked impossible simply fell inside their new boundary of comfortable. This reframes something important about how you should think about your own impossible thing, especially if it currently feels far beyond anything you could realistically attempt today. You're probably not meant to leap directly at it. You're meant to find your current edge, whatever feels slightly beyond comfortable right now, connected to that larger goal, and engage with exactly that, repeatedly, until it becomes comfortable enough that a new edge forms slightly further along the path. This is less satisfying than the idea of a single dramatic transformation. It requires patience that the cultural mythology around success rarely accounts for. But according to everything Hill documented, it's also the only version of this process that actually works consistently across hundreds of different lives, in hundreds of different circumstances. The impossible thing you're carrying right now didn't become impossible by accident, and it won't become possible by accident either. It becomes possible through a specific, daily practice of finding your actual edge and choosing, again and again, to engage with exactly that, not the comfortable center and not the overwhelming periphery, but the precise boundary where productive difficulty actually lives. There's one more piece to this, though. Something about what happens specifically at the moment someone realizes the impossible thing has actually started to become possible. A moment Hill found was almost always different than people expected it to be. Hill expected, going into this part of his research, that the moment someone realized their impossible thing had become achievable would feel dramatic. A clear before and after. A specific point where doubt converted cleanly into certainty. That's not what he found. What he documented instead was something almost anticlimactic, at least in the moment it actually happened. The men he studied, asked to identify the specific point where they realized the impossible thing had become genuinely possible, almost universally struggled to name an exact moment. Not because the shift didn't happen, because it happened too gradually to register as a single event while it was occurring. What they could describe, with more clarity, was a kind of retrospective recognition. A moment, sometimes months or years after the actual shift, where they looked back and realized that the thing that used to feel impossible no longer produced that familiar wall-like resistance. It had, somewhere along the way, simply become something they did. Something inside their actual capability, rather than something they were still working to reach. This retrospective quality matters, because it corrects a common misunderstanding about how this entire process actually feels from the inside. Most people expect that working towards something impossible should eventually produce a clear, identifiable moment of breakthrough. A specific day where the impossible visibly becomes possible, accompanied by some kind of internal certainty that confirms the shift has happened. Hill's research suggests this expectation is almost always wrong, and that expecting it actually creates a specific kind of frustration that derails people unnecessarily. Because if you're waiting for a clear, dramatic moment of breakthrough as confirmation that your effort is working, and that moment never arrives in the form you're expecting, it's easy to conclude that the effort isn't working at all. But Hill found that the actual mechanism doesn't produce that kind of clear signal. It produces gradual capability, built through the edge work we discussed, that eventually crosses a threshold so quietly that the person experiencing it often doesn't notice until they look back and realize how much distance they've actually covered. This has a practical implication worth sitting with. If you're currently engaged in the difficult middle of pursuing your own impossible thing, and you haven't experienced a clear, dramatic moment confirming that your effort is working, that absence isn't necessarily evidence that something is wrong. It might simply be the normal texture of this process, the gradual, often invisible accumulation of capability that only becomes visible in retrospect, once enough of it has accumulated to notice. Hill found something else worth mentioning here, something that surprised the men he interviewed when they recognized it in their own experience. The capability that eventually allowed them to accomplish their impossible thing rarely arrived as a sudden, complete transformation. It arrived as a series of small, almost unremarkable improvements, each one barely noticeable on its own, that compounded over enough time to produce a result that looked, from the outside, like a sudden and dramatic change. The outside view and the inside experience were almost always different. From the outside, it looked like someone had suddenly become capable of something impossible. From the inside, it felt like a long sequence of ordinary days, most of them unremarkable, occasionally difficult, rarely feeling like they were building toward anything significant in the moment they were happening. This is worth remembering specifically because it changes what you should actually be looking for as evidence that your own process is working, not a dramatic breakthrough. Small, almost boring, barely noticeable improvement, repeated consistently enough that it eventually compounds into something that will look, from the outside, and even to your own future self looking back, like it happened suddenly. It didn't happen suddenly. It happened the way everything Hill documented actually happens. Quietly, gradually, through the accumulated weight of ordinary days where you simply continued engaging with your actual edge, whether or not that day produced any visible evidence that the engagement was working. There's one final piece of understanding that ties everything together. Something about what this entire process actually reveals about thinking itself, and why Hill considered this, by the end of his life, the single most important thing he ever discovered. Late in his life, Hill returned to a question that had been sitting underneath his entire body of research from the beginning, even though he hadn't fully articulated it until decades after his initial interviews with Carnegie. What is thinking, actually? Not as a philosophical exercise, as a practical question with real implications for everything we've discussed in this video. Most people, asked this question, would describe thinking as something that happens to them. Thoughts arrive, seemingly on their own, and the person experiencing them either follows where those thoughts lead or doesn't. Thinking, in this common understanding, is largely passive. Something the mind does automatically, in response to circumstances, rather than something a person actively directs. Hill came to believe this understanding was almost exactly backward, and that this single misunderstanding explained more about why some people accomplish what looks impossible while others don't than almost anything else in his research. Thinking, as Hill eventually understood it, isn't something that happens to you. It's closer to a skill, a practiced capability that, like any other skill, can be developed deliberately and improved specifically through repeated, intentional engagement. Most people never develop this skill because they've never recognized that thinking is something you can actually get better at, rather than simply a passive byproduct of having a functioning brain. This reframes everything we've discussed throughout this entire video. The wall that feels like impossible isn't a fact about reality. It's a thought, specifically an old, automatic thought, generated by historical pattern recognition rather than current evidence. And if thinking is a skill rather than a passive process, then the specific kind of thinking that generates that wall is something you can actually learn to do differently. Working faith isn't a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It's a specific way of thinking about uncertainty, practiced deliberately, until it becomes more automatic than the fear-based thinking it eventually replaces. The identity shift that happens in the aftermath of significant failure isn't something that simply occurs to lucky people. It's the result of a specific kind of thinking applied deliberately in a difficult moment, where the question of who you are becomes more important than the immediate evidence that quitting might be reasonable. Working the edge isn't an accident of circumstance. It requires a specific, deliberate kind of thinking. The ongoing practice of locating where current comfort ends and productive difficulty begins, and choosing, repeatedly, to direct your effort there rather than retreating to easier ground. Every principle we've covered in this video, when you trace it back to its actual source, comes down to the same underlying capability. the deliberate direction of thought. Not controlling every thought that arrives. That's not actually possible, and Hill never suggested otherwise. But developing the capacity to notice which thoughts you're following, and to deliberately choose different ones when the automatic thoughts are leading somewhere that doesn't serve the life you're actually trying to build. This is, according to everything Hill documented across 20 years and 500 interviews, the actual answer to the question this entire video has been built around. How does thinking make you conquer the impossible? Not through positive thinking in the shallow, decorative sense that phrase usually implies. Not through simply deciding to feel confident regardless of circumstances. Through the deliberate, practiced redirection of automatic thought. Noticing when the mind is reporting old fear as current fact. Choosing working faith over the comfort of certainty. Engaging repeatedly with your actual edge rather than retreating to comfortable ground. And allowing significant failure to reveal an identity rather than confirm a limitation. None of this happens through a single decision. It happens through the accumulated weight of thousands of small moments where you choose, deliberately, to think differently than your automatic patterns would otherwise have you think. That choice, repeated daily, across enough ordinary days, is what eventually produces a life capable of the things that once looked completely impossible. Let's go back to where we started. A man standing in front of 3,000 failed experiments, saying, with complete calm, that he hadn't failed once. I asked you at the beginning of this video, what if the impossible isn't a fact about the world? What if it's a description of how a mind hasn't learned to think yet? You've spent the last hour with everything underneath that question. The wall that isn't built from reality, but from old memory, mistaken for present fact. The origin point of that wall, usually small, usually forgotten, usually someone else's limited perspective passed down at a moment you had no defenses against it. Working faith, the willingness to act before certainty arrives, letting belief follow effort instead of waiting for it to come first. The edge, found and engaged with daily, not leapt across in a single dramatic moment. The identity that forms not in success, but in the specific decision to continue after a failure that would have justified stopping. And underneath all of it, the same quiet truth. Thinking was never something happening to you. It was always something available to you. Edison didn't have a wall the way most people do, not because he was different in some fundamental, unreachable way. He had simply, through years of engaging with his own edge, learned to think about failure differently than the thinking most of us inherited without ever examining it. That capability was never reserved for him specifically. It was always available to anyone willing to do the quiet, unremarkable, daily work of noticing which thoughts they're following and choosing, again and again, to follow different ones. You came into this video carrying something that feels impossible. You're probably still carrying it now, in this exact moment, listening to these words. It hasn't become possible in the last hour. That was never going to happen from watching a video. But something underneath it has, perhaps, shifted slightly. A wall that felt permanent might feel, even faintly, like something temporary instead. A piece of incomplete information, rather than a final verdict. That shift, small, quiet, almost invisible right now, is exactly how everything Hill documented actually begins. Not with certainty, with a single, different thought, followed by another, until enough of them have accumulated to carry you somewhere your old thinking never could have reached. The impossible thing you're carrying was never actually impossible. It was just waiting for you to think about it differently. And now, quietly, without announcement, without any dramatic moment to mark the occasion, you already have. If this video gave you something worth carrying, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who are ready to think differently too. Every video here exists for one reason: to help you discover that the impossible was never the wall you thought it was.